Welcome to the Strong Enough Podcast, your relationship wellness podcast. I'm your host, Claudia. Today's guest is going to share with us how his experiences as a young man led him to a place of wanting to expose the abuse going on in the independent fundamentalist Baptist church. He will also share with us his thoughts on religion today and how this affects his relationship with his family. Please help me in welcoming Eric Skwarczynski. Eric, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. I'm excited to be here. How's your day going?
Going really well. Excited to be on here. I'm not a ex-Navy SEAL or one of the cool, badass titles that you usually have on the show, but I'll do my best. So.
I have all the faith in the world in you, and I think you do have a badass title. You are also a podcast host, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I'd like to start with a little bit of your background. So if you don't mind sharing a little bit about yourself, where you came from, what you do.
Yeah. So like you said, my name is Eric Skwarczynski. I host the Preacher Boys podcast, and the goal of the show is exposing abuse within independent fundamental Baptist churches. And the reason I focus in on that denomination, because that's the first question everyone asks, why them? I grew up within that world for the first 18 years of my life. I went to, I was in the womb going to church services, but I was there for kindergarten through my senior year of high school on the same campus, going to the conferences within that world. I grew up as a staff kid, so I was there literally 7 days a week. Graduated from there, then went back into it, spent another 3 years in there. So I spent a lot of time, the majority of my life was in that world. And the reason that I started the show was that around my 10th or 11th grade year, we had someone get switched over to our church, kind of did the predator shuffle, moved somebody over. I found out first just by Googling their name that they were a youth pastor that had molested a teenager in their youth group. And I tried to get adults in the church to take it seriously and address the situation. And to give an indication of how successful I was, he was on the platform as of last Sunday. So, it really opened my eyes. It burst my bubble because I was in this little religious bubble. I thought we were, the one true church. We were the safe, secure spot. And it burst my bubble that this could happen. And then digging into it deeper, I realized that it wasn't an isolated incident. This was something that was happening church after church going back decades. So really opened my eyes to it and, really set me on a path of trying to figure out what's going on, what's happening in this denomination.
So you said you grew up in this church. It was kind of your way of life for all this time. So when all these things happened, what did it make you feel, A, about your church and then about religion in general?
Yeah. So what's hard about it is, I tell a lot of people, I think there's an expectation when they see what I do that I look back on those first 18 years and just go, it was awful. I was, it was bad experiences, no good memories, glad I'm out. And those experiences do exist, especially toward the latter end of my time there. But for the first 16 years of my life there, I didn't see any red flags. I didn't see anything negative. And honestly, there wasn't as much negative as you'd expect early on. And so all of my good memories, as much as there are bad memories, all of those good memories are associated there too. That's where I rode bikes, that's where I hung out with friends. That was my life. What did happen, because it was my life, is that when someone did infiltrate the church where I was at, it didn't just affect that aspect. It affected every aspect of my life. It affected my relationship with my parents. It affected my friendships. It affected, the relationship with the girl I was interested in. It affected, my relationship with my youth pastor, was like a second father to me. It affected my faith in the church, the institution, the denomination. It affected my faith in God. It devastated every area of my life because the church was in every area of my life. And so it was a really hard situation. And what it did was, and this is something that's still hard for me to grapple with, is what it did is there was this eagerness to accept someone who was a predator into the fold. And then for me calling it out, I was pushed out and isolated by the church. And so it was just it's one of those things. And I think this is kind of typical of a lot of like abusive environments or relationships, is that even though it's not a healthy place to be, sometimes it's easy to almost envy the acceptance that others receive within that relationship or within that environment. And so it was really hard for me to grapple. It's still hard for me to grapple with, if I'm being completely honest. When I drive by or when I see people that avoid me a little bit now, it's still hurtful. Even though I know I don't want to be back in that church or be back around those people, it's still a difficult thing to grapple with, at times. But it's just, I think it's that emotional desire for the community.
There's always that desire to be accepted and to be in with the people that you've always been in with, kind of like
Right.
you said. So you mentioned that this really affected all of your relationships because the church was part of all of your relationships. So what was it like to talk to your parents about this and to feel, and I don't know, you tell us whether they didn't believe you, didn't take you seriously. How did that feel?
Yeah. So there was two people that I went to. So the first was my parents, and I telling them, it was a mix of two things. One, my mom was really upset, and but within that denomination, within that world, women don't really have a voice, and so she did push, from what I understand, and a lot of this was behind the scenes, and her, kind of repeating it to me later, but she did try to address it and was shut down pretty quickly. And so she kind of got forced into silence mode. And she was like that with me. She was very silent about it with me. I think now because it was just frustrating for her. But at that time, it put a lot of strain because I was like, why don't you speak up about it if it bothers you? And then the other side of it was my dad. And my dad is a really, really good guy, outside of that church. I mean, he doesn't take jury cases where there's abuse of a child because he's like, I can't be fair minded. Like, I'll just say, don't risk it. Like, let's send him to jail and, all that kind of stuff. And so it was very confusing for me that he didn't take this situation more seriously. But what happened is that he was relying on what the pastor was saying. So the pastor was saying, it's fine. I think it's okay. We dealt with it, blah, blah, blah. My dad took that as gospel. And so what was really frustrating in the situation was that, I'm sitting there going, you should be furious about that. Like, you should be taking this super seriously. And I think he would, if he wasn't just blindly following the leadership of the pastor who was there. So it was a really strenuous relationship. The other was my youth pastor, who, like I said, he was like a second father figure to me. And so, he was very direct in saying, you're just bitter. You need to forgive him, move on, don't address this, like, stop talking about it. And really, I went from, in the course of those last 2 years, I went from being, father-son relationship, like literally was going out every week for lunch and like hanging out at his house and like really close, to not in the hallway type relationship. And so that was a very tough one. And then that intersecting with my actual dad, like him texting my dad, telling him I was being this rebellious, bitter teen because I was upset about this. Like, it was just, again, it was very isolating, I guess is the only way I can explain it. It was a very, very isolating way to spend the last 2 years of high school. And then even into, the next couple of years after having left.
How did you deal with that isolation?
Just by being depressed and angstier than an average teenager, or maybe just as angsty as a normal teenager. And, not well. It was really frustrating. And, I had a very explosive temper those last 2 years. My friends laugh about it now, or at least one of my friends laughs about it now. But, he can remember being on the other side of the campus and hearing me like screaming in my dad's office, like that no one was taking it seriously. So like, in a sense, I think it was justified anger. But I just, the best way I can describe the last 2 years is there was no healthy outlet to express how hurt I felt. And there was no safe spot to talk about all of the emotions and all of the the reaction to me being upset was like, why are you so upset? It didn't happen to you, or it didn't happen to someone you know. And it's like, yeah, but if you guys are okay with this, what else are you okay with? And if this can happen at, this can happen at a church in our denomination, which is the right denomination, like that means it's not as safe as I thought. And like, I'm supposed to have kids and then, have them here. Like all those thoughts are spiraling through my mind. And it's like, who can I talk to? I can't talk to my religious leaders, can't talk to my parents, can't talk to my other father figures, can't talk to my friends because I'm not supposed to be gossiping about, it was a difficult, position to be in.
It sounds very much like an abusive relationship in that, what you just said, you were isolated, you couldn't talk to anybody.
No.
Everybody else was in this circle and you couldn't really break through. Would you agree
Right.
with that?
Yeah, I'd say so. I would say it opened my eyes beyond just opening my eyes to the issue of abuse. It also opened my eyes to how conditional the acceptance was of the movement and specifically the church I was in. Because like I said, I went from, I was a really good kid. Like I did things that were bad, like any kid, but I was a good kid. Like I look back on it, me and my dad never had a screaming match before this situation happened. I never slammed my door and said, I hate you. Like I never went through that phase of my teenage life. I think I missed out on the party, crazy stage of teenage years, but I really wasn't. Like I was helping with ministries and bus routes. And like I was for all intents and purposes, I was a poster kid for what they were trying to push. And, but the minute I stepped out of line, those connections dried up. And the minute I stopped, stepping in with what they wanted to happen and following the narrative they wanted me to follow, I very quickly lost those relationships. And, that for me showed, and I had friends that would, talk about it and say like, oh, it's this church is legalistic or they expect you to have these things done. And I would be like, no, that's crazy. And it gave validity to that because I saw my own connections drop up. I saw my own status drop very quickly from being like, hey, you're an example to, by the time I left, like, oh, you're never coming back and speaking at a chapel. You're never coming back and doing that. Like you're done. That was kind of the messaging. And so, yeah, I think it was definitely an abusive kind of psychological thing. There was a lot hung over my head as far as like, do this or else this happens.
Now, you said that one of the arguments that people made with you was that this never happened to you. This never happened to anyone that you know. So what made you Google this person's name? What led you to that place of wanting to know more?
It was honestly pure curiosity. So I knew this person. He was a coach. I can say his name. It's Jesse Roll if someone wants to Google for the full story. But I knew of him from another school that was in Chico, California. We were over in Banning, California, so North and South California. And I knew of him. I heard that he was going to be coming to our church. It just, oh, hey, by the way, Jesse will be here. He's going to start coming here. And I was like, why? Oh, he's just moving down here, change of pace, wants to go to a different ministry or something. The narrative that had been told was, and I think was believed by everybody at that point, was that he was, just coming into, after a disagreement with his dad who pastored the other church, he was going to come in, check out a new environment, just try to get away and distance and be his own person. And I just thought it was really weird. And I texted one of the guys that I knew from his basketball team and said, hey, are you sad that your coach is moving? That was the text. And he said, not really. He's like, he didn't even say goodbye to us, but he had no idea what happened either. And I was like, that's really weird. Mm-hmm. So I just Googled his name to see if the church had put out like an announcement or something. And when I Googled his name, there was like 2 or 3 articles, but the article that popped up was that there had been a warrant issued for his arrest. And that sent me down this like, okay, what's going on? What's happening? And, when I first got the information, I didn't know what to do with it, but it was like a day or 2 later, I ended up showing it, I think it was to my youth pastor first. I don't remember who it was, but it was just a very surprising thing. Like I didn't have any suspect that that's what it was. Mm-hmm. It was just pure curiosity that led to a very easy discovery. So
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned a warrant out for his arrest. So did that ever see its way through the justice system, or did that
I'm
kind of go away as well?
so I don't understand. I've been podcasting for like a year and a half on this, and there's still so much about the legal system I don't understand. So, and I've talked with so many lawyers in law enforcement, and it just seems like some of it just doesn't make sense,
Mm-hmm.
even to people within it. But from what I understand, the reason that he left suddenly from the other church was so he couldn't be served with the warrant. So he moved to go to a different address. So he stayed with a family member in Banning. What I understand is it did affect something with the case where they couldn't serve something, but he did end up going. He did end up getting his time in court and did end up pleading no contest and did end up getting sentenced and everything like that. But and it was a very light sentence, but whatever. It did all happen. But I think initially, from what I understand, the reason he had left is so he couldn't be served. I think they were waiting. It was some kind of tactic, or maneuver to try to avoid, that. But as far as like all the ins and outs of that, like all I know is what's in the article and then what I have from the secondhand, information that's close to it. And like I said, I'm sure if I knew more about the legal process, I would probably be able to break that down a little bit better. But
We can definitely talk about that later. After the episode, I have a few comments I could share with you. One thing that I do find interesting, you mentioned he did go through the process. He pled no contest, probably served little to no actual jail time.
Yeah.
How does that feel? Because I know we're dealing, recently with some other cases where maybe people feel like justice wasn't served in the way that they think it should have been served. So what do you say to those people?
Yeah, it was frustrating. There was I don't believe there was any jail time. I think he may have spent like 2 days or something. It was a probationary period. It was about 5 years, I believe. He was supposed to just do counseling, which he did with somebody from our church. It was not it was just he may have seen a professional as well, but I know that like a good portion of that was like pastoral counseling, which I don't have stock in. And I say that as somebody who identifies as a Christian still. I don't think pastoral counseling is helpful in these situations, but it was just infuriating. It was frustrating that I don't feel like the court system did what it needed to do in it. I don't feel like justice was really carried out. And what bothered me is that through all of that, he spent a year maybe off the platform at the church, and, he's still there every Sunday, and it's just this. And what's frustrating about that is that nobody at the church really knows that situation now, outside of people who've listened to me talk about it or have talked to me directly. People in that bubble still don't know. And so it's concerning to me that, there's somebody there who has done this. The stats that they change is very, very not in his favor. And so it's concerning that way. But what I will say is really upsetting to me now as I look at it in retrospect. At the time, it just made me upset because I felt like, does anybody take this seriously? Like the police don't take it seriously. My family doesn't. What really bothers me in retrospect is one of the reasons he got such a light sentence is he was 30, she was 14, almost 15 at the time. And, the relationship was touching underneath the clothes. So that was what the charge was. It was contact underneath the clothes, bare breasts, bare bottom. That was what he pled to. What bothers me is that courts deal with these cases as purely the molestation, which is definitely a piece of it. But I think where society has really fallen behind is understanding the gravity of what grooming looks like first and foremost. So like, I think there's still a lot of assumed fault on the side of the teenager. That's one piece. But the part that really bothers me now, diving into the religious side or talking with, people like Sarah Edmondson from the Nexium cult and things like that, is the court and society as a whole has yet to really understand the nature of, brainwashing, religious manipulation. Like in this case with him, this is somebody who has extreme religious authority within their group. And so when you have somebody who considers themselves a man of God telling you to do something, and there are eternal stakes in your mind, and there are all of the pressures of being in a religious environment, when that's utilized against you, I think that makes it much more of an aggravated type of assault. And I don't think that most judges take that into account when they look at a case where it says like, hey, a youth pastor and a 15-year-old, they don't really understand the gravity of what that looks like and how much pressure and manipulation is at their disposal at that. And I think, I don't know what that, and I'm not saying I have the solution to this, but it's really shocking to me when I see guys get off with 90 days, when they're literally leveraging someone's mental, spiritual, like every element of their life is being twisted to abuse them. And they're walking away with just charges for molestation or just for touching them. And it's like, it's so much more than that. But like I said, I don't have the answer to that. I just think that we're behind in understanding like how serious it is and like how non-consensual it is. Like it's, you can't consent when someone is giving you spiritual commands to do something. You just can't.
Absolutely. I know in Colorado, there are laws, and I would have to look them up because I haven't looked at them in a long time, but there are specific statutes related to people in a position of authority. So a little bit like what you're talking about, but I would have to look and see if even a pastoral relationship is included in that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do some research. One thing I noticed that you said was that the people in that bubble still don't really know everything that happened. Now, we're in a day and age where we can get on our phone and know virtually everything. So what is it about this group of people that they're not looking, they're not curious, or just they're not even seeing it because it's easy to stumble upon things as well?
Well, it's the news that most people get within IFB circles, and this is, I think, starting to change because you just can't outrun the internet, is, the information you get comes from the pulpit. And so I think for most people, that's where they're getting their news. And I think also, we live in a time now, like what I'm seeing is like the term fake news gets thrown around so much. It's easy, it's easy for pastors to throw out that terminology and kind of weaponize that and say like, oh, they're attacking our church, or you might see some gossip going around. You might hear some rumors. You might hear a podcast. And I've had plenty of pastors preach sermons like this since I've started my show. You might hear these losers with laptops with these podcasts, like exact verbiage, like very much suppressing the fact that this is legitimate news. And so I think there's a mix of people that either don't know, they know, but they're reading it through a filter. So they're looking at the victim and saying, well, they're attacking the church or they're bitter, which is ridiculous because a lot of the people that get preyed on are the most devout members, or a lot of the people that are most upset are people like me who like, I didn't love anything more than I loved the church I was at. So it's a very, everything is filtered. That's the best way to put it. And I would say, beyond it just being filtered, like I think there's some people that just don't even want to grasp the idea that it could happen in their church. Like I think for some people, the idea that this could actually happen is so foreign, and the idea that something could infiltrate their safe bubble is so, alien to them that they just refuse to hear it. And I think it's one of those three. It's either filtered, they don't hear it, or they refuse to hear it. And once in a great while, it breaks through and somebody leaves. But it's very hard work. And it's taken a lot. Like I've had people that have left because of my show that have told me, and I'm not saying that to say I'm the only reason people leave, but I'm saying that from my conversations, like every conversation I've had with somebody who's left due to my show, who's cited that as a reason, has said, I listened to you initially, like frustrated that you were doing it and wanted to tear it apart, and then started listening more. And then a year later, decided I needed to change. And then a few months later actually did. Like it's a long, long process.
Let's talk about what that process was like for you, because it would have been so easy for you to just forget all about it, as
Right.
people told you to do. When you're in that moment and you're telling something, you're very vulnerable, you're sharing, and people are basically ignoring you, telling you to shut up, telling you it's not true. So it would have been easy in that moment for you to say, yeah, okay, I'm just going to forget about it. I'm going to rejoin my happy bubble, forget this isolation. What in you said, I can't do that? I have to stay true to what I believe right now.
I think part of that's just DNA of me. Like I've always had that. Like my dad has always said, it's ironic now referring to this topic we're talking about. My dad always said the best and worst thing about raising me was that I always asked a lot of questions. So I was not fall in line. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Mm.
Like I would get to that point, but I had to know, my first question was always why. Like, why are we doing that? What's the reason? What's this going to do? And so I think for a lot of people, I think it might be easy to just forget it and move in. For me, that was never an option. Like even if I wanted to, it would have always eaten away at me and say like, this question's unanswered. Like I have to figure this out. And that's what did ultimately make me leave was, I could not wrap my head around why this was happening. And the answers I was getting were either you're bitter, you're angry, or it's not that big a deal. But I was sitting there with stacks of papers of people from the 80s and 90s and cases that looked the same repeated over and over and over again. And I was going like, it is happening a lot. Like this is not isolated. So for me, the decision to leave initially was frustration and disenchantment with the actual church that I was in. And also I was kind of just pushed out. So there was part of that. They would say that's not the case, but that was the case. That's what happened. My final straw within that world was, after I'd been gone for a few years, I ended up joining a missions agency that was still connected to that movement a little bit. And I just got to see firsthand the politics, the emotional manipulation. We had a large independent Baptist church drop our financial support because we didn't wear ties in India in 116-degree heat with 90% humidity. That was a legitimate letter that we got. I've kept that. And then the person that I worked for was total narcissist. I was getting paid like $500 a month. He was paying himself well over a 6-figure salary, driving nice cars, had a cool apartment. Like he was a profiteer off of the nonprofit. And so that for me was kind of a final straw. Had another falling out with a supporting church there. It was just every time that I kept inching my way back into that world, like something would happen that was a major red flag. And that instance, because like bad things happen everywhere. Like you can't just take one thing and say this is a problem. But what would happen is when something bad would happen to me or to someone I knew, I would look into it within the movement historically. Mm-hmm. And I would see that this was something that happened with all of the biggest names in that religious denomination over and over and over again. The manipulation, the financial stuff, the sex, all of that spread back for years. And so I started realizing this is a systemic thing. This is something that's being taught directly and indirectly in the seminaries and the colleges and all of that. And so for me, it wasn't an option to stay. Like my personality type is too investigative to to just stick in it and just put my head down. Like that's just not my personality. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. But I think in this case, it's been a lifesaver for me.
I think for you and so many other people, which we're going to talk about in a second as it relates to your podcast, but what was it like for you when you left? So how was that with your parents? Do you still have a relationship with them? Does it look differently now than it did before?
I definitely still have a relationship with them. I think in a sense, this is compartmentalized a little bit. I think my mom's still in a position she can't really talk about a lot of it. I think my dad is still, I think he's listening more about some of it, from what I can tell, but I think he's still first and foremost, I think it's just going to be like what the pastor says is going to heavily filter how he processes it, and how the movement talks about it, and I think my dad's in a place, and I can't really speak for him, but I think he's in a place where it's hard for him to imagine that it's as bad as I'm saying it is, or it's hard for him to imagine that, the guest speaker that they're having has done the things I've said he's done, or that, like they had a lawyer, David Gibson, to speak, who I told my dad, I said, a few weeks ago before speaking at your graduation, he was 45 minutes across the next city, defending a church against 4 survivors who were, raped or molested over the last, 3 decades. And he just can't process that that's the case, and so it's just it's a very slow process. But again, I think there are people who are really bad people who enable this stuff. And I think with him, it's very confusing, because I think he's a good person who just doesn't, there's so much religious clouding around all of this that it makes it hard for him to see it. But I think that's why you have to choose, and we can talk about this a little bit, but I think you have to choose who to be patient with, and choose who to kind of shake and say, like, wake up, or just completely cut off because they're part of the problem. But it's hard to do that. It's hard to be patient and talk through stuff and present information. And it's exhausting. I've been doing it for several years now, and it's a long, long, long road.
What you said reminds me a lot of what we talk about with domestic abuse survivors. There's often that ability to be in denial, to minimize the behavior. And it is very frustrating, because it's easy for us to see what's going on. Yeah. And it's so hard often for them to see it when it's happening to themselves. And I experienced that myself. So is that sort of how you look at your dad? And I don't want to say he's a survivor, but kind of in that mindset where he's got so much denial and minimization to filter through, that it's a little bit easier for you to compartmentalize that aspect of your relationship to move forward with your relationship as a whole.
I think it is part of that. I think the best way I can explain is it's kind of how you said it, is in a relationship. So I talk a lot about like cults within, and I think that's a very loaded word. I think a better term is what like Stephen Hassan uses, which is authoritarian groups or high control groups. I think what people miss is that these types of groups don't always prey on just weak people. Abusers don't prey on weak people. They prey on people who have very good characteristics, who are very kind people, usually very smart, very intelligent. I talked about this with I mentioned Sarah Evanson with NXIVM. Like, she was a driven entrepreneurial actress. Like, she was about to start hitting it. Like, she was a good person, wanted to change the world, all this stuff. And it's like, how do you get involved in this crazy, NXIVM cult, And one of the things they clarified early on in our interview was that, that there's a misconception that people get sucked into cults. Like, they take things that are good qualities and leverage them against you. And I think with my dad, legitimately wants to help people, legitimately wants to see people, change. And he wants to see people have positive experiences, doesn't want to damage anybody, wants to protect the reputation of the school because it's doing good work, and the church because it's doing good work, and wants to follow the pastor because he believes the pastor's the man of God. Like, so all of those things that are good things in a good, proper place. But the thing is, when somebody who has nefarious intentions or someone who's doing something wrong leverages those against them, you find yourself in a really bad situation. And, that's where, I do think, and I've told my dad, I think he does need to accept responsibility for some of this and say, like, okay, we didn't handle it correctly. I should have asked more questions. But do I put him in a category of having this nefarious intention or trying to cover it up? No, I think his good qualities have been leveraged for bad purposes. And that's a very common thing in relation. You know what I mean? It's the reason, like you said, you'll see someone who's like such a rational person in an abusive relationship. You're like, this is toxic. Like, why don't you leave? And you get the, I can change it, or, or they need me, or they need the support. And like, all of that is just playing out in an organization versus just a one-to-one relationship.
Are you hopeful that your dad will see the light and realize what is really going on?
I think so. I think anybody who has a good heart and is willing to be objective is eventually going to drift away from these types of churches. Again, not every church in the denomination is bad, but I would say the ones that are good are outliers. The ones that have really good pastors are outliers. I think my dad is too good of a person to stay in it forever. But that being said, I think the piece I just mentioned about being objective is the hard part. Getting him to be objective about it is difficult. And I mentioned that over the phone before. I said, if I put all of these situations and I said, this is the church down the road, you would see very clearly how bad this is. But because it's in your backyard, it's totally missed. And it's hard for him to be objective about it. And I think, but again, I am hopeful. I think, like I said, anybody that has a good head on their shoulders will eventually step away. It's a frustrating, long process. But again, that's why you have to be careful, like who you spend time trying to move out. You have to really be careful how you read people. And there's other people at the church I think are on the same path. But there are other ones who just truly wouldn't care. You know what I mean? Like, and that's, it's hard to know who those people are, but you can tell pretty quickly once you start really talking to them, what type of person they are.
Would you say you're actively working with people, not with people in that church, but to make them have those realizations?
No, I would say the only thing that I can do and the only thing anybody can do is present evidence. And so for me, it's not a daily methodical approach to it. I think for me, it's when something is relevant. So like, for example, when a speaker comes in, I'll send my dad a message and say, just so you know, a month ago, they were involved with this case, or just so you know, they are really good friends with this person who has covered up sexual abuse, or just so you know, and so presenting the evidence, getting the information out there and allowing people to make the decision, because you cannot force anybody to do anything. They have to come to it on their own, whether you're talking about a sales conversation or whether you're talking about joining a religion or all those sorts of things. People are somewhere because they chose to be there. And so you have to give them a convincing reason to leave. And so the only way you can do that is not through the emotional side. It's not through saying, hey, you're in a cult, because that's going to get the door shut in your face really quickly. And in most cases, confirm the persecution complex that they probably have already been taught to have. All you can do is say, here's the facts. Like, why are you okay with this? And once they run out of answers for why it's okay, they'll leave. Or they'll burn out, fall in line, and, cut off contact, but like I said, all I can do is present the information and, let it be what it is.
So I'm guessing, first off, your dad probably hates getting those, just so you know, text messages from you. How will it feel if he doesn't ever make that realization, if he doesn't ever see the truth?
It'll be frustrating. It'll be disappointing, but I think, I don't know. Again, I can't speak for him. From what I see on the outside, I think that I think he's more receptive than he's ever been to hearing it. Like I said, when I first brought this up as a 16 or 17-year-old, it led to our first ever like screaming match, and it's gone from that to thanks for letting me know. So that's a big jump. And so again, I can't picture that, but also, like I said, I can't anchor my own. It's important not to anchor your own mental health and your own sense of fulfillment on what other people are going to do. Even if it is hard, like it is very hard for me to know that my dad's still there. And, my dad is coming on the platform after this guy's stepping off of the platform, and people are drawing that connection between the two of them. Like that really bothers me. But at the end of the day, like I can't allow my own well-being to be anchored to what he's doing. So it would suck. It would be awful, but it would be, I think I've already, like I said, it's been 8 years since this initially went down, 9 years. So I guess I've kind of gone through the acceptance stage of some of it, because it's a day-to-day, like that is what is the situation. And so on some level, it is what it is at some point.
I really want to take a moment to emphasize what you said, because I think it is applicable to so many different relationships, so many different things. And that is, you can't anchor your own well-being, your own mental health, your own self-fulfillment on somebody else's actions. That's one of the most difficult things for people to realize, because they are waiting for that closure, waiting for that moment, waiting for these things that may actually never happen because it's in someone else's hands.
Right.
So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and you're putting yourself, I mean, the minute you get on a plane, the first thing they tell you is to put your oxygen mask on first. And I think with so many people trying to help people get out of abusive relationships, get out of cultish environments, is they want to fumble around and say, like, I need you to survive this. Like, let's get you moving. Let's protect you. But in the meantime, they're falling apart because like they're just so busy helping somebody else. And the reality is, if you can put your oxygen mask on, which is the hard thing to do, it's hard to say, there's someone I care about next to me, I want to make sure they're good. If you can put your oxygen mask on, get your oxygen going, take a second to assess the situation, you're going to be able to help them in a much more meaningful way than frantically shaking them, saying like, let's help you. And so when it comes to this stuff, you have to be able to do the work and say, I'm in a good place. I'm mentally okay. I've processed what I'm going through. I've gone through the steps to recover from my experiences. Now let me turn around and show them how that worked for me, versus like, let's go down together, which I think most relationships are, which is like, oh, she's still with him. Like that's, I can't sleep at night because I know she's still with him, or they're still in that organization. I can't sleep until they get out of there. Like that frustration and that kind of hyper way of dealing with it is not helping anybody. It's just sinking two people. Like you have to get on solid ground before you start reaching down and pulling someone else up.
Absolutely. I just want to flash that across the screen like 70 times because it's so important for people to hear.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your podcast. So you have been doing this roughly a year and a half, I believe.
It started January 2020. So it's been just about a year and a half.
So first off, congratulations, because your success is phenomenal. What led you to do this? What made you decide, you know what, I want to shine a light on this issue and I'm going to do it with a podcast?
So what happened was basically I had been out of the movement for about 8 years or so. And I hadn't really been outspoken publicly about anything that had happened or my issues with the movement. I would write occasionally like blog articles or things, just kind of talking about my experience, but really didn't dive into the abuse side at all. It was like a lot more like the theology of things or things like that, just things I was working through. And what happened was in the end of 2019, there was a story that was going pretty viral within the independent Baptist circles and former member circles. And it was this girl, Sarah Jackson, who I actually interviewed on my show. And she was in a situation where she was a 15-year-old teenager, 30-year-old pastor. And, it just played beat for beat so similar to the story that I had referenced earlier and had seen firsthand. Hers was horrific when you really get into the details of so much of the manipulation that happened, the religious manipulation from the pastor and all the levels of cover up relating to the case. And I saw that and I was literally driving home from work doing marketing at that time, driving home from work. And I was sitting there and going like, how is this happening again? Like, how is this still going on? Like that was 2013. Now we're in 2019. Like we're still going through this stuff. And what set me over the edge was I started seeing independent Baptist pastors as I was going through Twitter threads and stuff. There were pastors praying for her abuser. There were pastors running fundraisers to pay for his legal expenses. There were blog articles about, false accusations and gossip. And I just got really upset. And I did a video in my car in my parking lot of my apartment complex. It was like 7 minutes. And I just said, I haven't talked about this. I haven't been part of this world for a long time, but if you're associated with, and I listed every pastor that had posted something in support. And I said, if you're associated with this person, this organization, and your pastor is going to continue partnering with them after this, you need to leave your church. And I posted that video got a little bit of traction. Like it definitely rippled within my own little network. But I had went inside and I told my wife, I had been kicking the idea around for years. I was like, I want to do a documentary or something about this topic. And she was always like, just do it or stop talking about it. Like, you keep talking about this, like, do it. And I told her, I said, I'm going to do it. So I sat down, edited a little 2-minute mock thing of like, here's what it could be. And that kind of blew up. Like, that was, it's like tons of views on it and all that kind of stuff. And I started getting, I told her, I said, if I could get like 2 or 3 people that'd be willing to share their story, that'd be great. I had like 20 people in the first week reach out and say, hey, I'd like to be involved. And what happened is I was like, there's way too much content here for an hour and a half. Like, I need to just do a podcast so I can start going through these stories. And, now there's 160 episodes, like, people sharing their stories. I've had hundreds of people reach out, like thousands of people that are tuning in and listening. And the problem now is, how do you create a documentary that matches the impact that the podcast is having? And luckily COVID kind of helped shut everything down, so I have time to think about it. But now I'm sitting here like, it's such a big problem. And what the podcast has done is shown these similarities across decades, across, even across gender, and like, it's just become such a big issue. And it looks like, the fact that a story from California resonates perfectly with a story in Maryland, with all these different churches, all these different players involved. It's just been really shocking, but it's been incredibly healing, I think, for everyone who's been involved. It's been healing for me to be able to sit down and know I'm not crazy and other people think this is an issue. It's just been awesome in a denomination where one person holds the microphone and tells you their view of things. It's been really refreshing to grab a microphone and put it in front of a survivor, especially female survivors who aren't allowed to ever speak out in a church service, that they get to share for 2 hours. Hey, here's what happened. Here's the people involved. Here's what I've been through and how I've come out the other side.
I know you said it was shocking, but how does it really feel that you are seeing this issue is so prevalent? It is across, different religions, even different states, probably the whole world, obviously the whole world. So how does that feel from just an emotional standpoint for you?
It's a lot of things. It's validating because I knew roughly some of the numbers, like, it's much more than I expected, but like, I knew roughly like, hey, this is happening. And I knew that like, hey, but it's something different when you put a name and a face and a story to each of those, there's a really famous story of abuse that, where the pastor's name is really known, but then it's like always, the pastor and the victim, or the pastor in this. And it's always really gut wrenching to then, like, victim becomes such and such a person's name, and victim becomes, this mother of 3 who's now grappling with, so like, it's very validating to know, like, this is real, like, this is true. And then I would say, as far as like the growth of the show and like the amount of people that have been involved, it's just bittersweet. Like, it's very, it makes me very excited that there's a ton of people that feel like they can share their story for the first time. And there's people that are hearing stories similar to theirs for the first time who felt very isolated. But obviously it's also like gut wrenching when you think like, oh, this show resonates with enough people to be getting thousands of downloads a month, that. It's just this weird mixed thing, but like I said, it's almost become like its own healthy community as opposed to the unhealthy isolation that I think people were feeling early on.
Something that you pointed out was very interesting to me. You said from moving that from victim to Sherry Jones, who has a family with 3 children and so forth and so on. So I know generally in the public and in the legal system, we don't publicize the names of victims in cases like sexual assault for their own protection. But I completely agree with what you said in that it turns it into a real human being. If it's just victim A, it's hard for us to personalize that. It's hard for us to make that into an actual human being with feelings and hopes and dreams and a future. Do you think there is any positivity to looking at doing more publicizing of names and who these people are through the justice system even?
I think it's case by case. And obviously I think the biggest piece is that it's the survivor's story. So like what they want to happen needs to happen in that case. I think especially as far as the benefit of it being public, I think what it does is it forces people, because I think in a lot of these cases, it's easy to go, oh, Pastor so-and-so would never do this. Okay. So that's usually, so with a lot of these cases you hear, youth pastor so-and-so or pastor so-and-so is being accused by somebody of doing this. It's pretty easy to go, I know of him. He wouldn't do that. But when you find out that this staff member or this longtime church member is accusing pastor so-and-so of this, what it does is it forces the congregation to go, I know that she wouldn't lie about this. I know that, she's not the type to just seek attention, all those misconceptions we throw at people who come forward. I know that she wouldn't do that. I know her. I know that she's trustworthy. So now I have 2 people that I have to reconcile are saying 2 sides of this story. And, when you really look at it that way, like it becomes a lot more difficult for people to just say like, oh, I know my pastor wouldn't do that. Like it's easy to say that when you're not sitting there also going like, well, I know that she wouldn't, she has no reason to say that he would, like there's, I think it's really important because it's easy to brush off a number. Like it's easy to brush off a statistic and say, for example, it's easy to say like, okay, 1 in 4 women are sexually assaulted. Okay. That's a number that you hear. But then if you start like putting names to those, so like, okay, I have 4 women in my family. So one of those, like imagine it in that context, that statistic becomes very scary. Or 1 in 6 for men. Like, okay, imagine 6 people, Now imagine one of them is abused. Like that puts it in a whole new light that just a number or Jane Doe or victim, victim A or victim B, like it just doesn't have that same impact to it. But like I said, ultimately, first and foremost, it needs to be in the role of the victim to be able to share what they want to share. I do think victim impact statements should be a lot more publicized than they are. I think that they don't get, and I think that the victim should have more control over how they present that and all of that sort of thing. But yeah, I definitely think it's valuable. I think it's valuable to be able to hear their name, see their, hear what their voice sounds like, see them, as opposed to just all the publicity being around the person who carried it out.
Right. And I do want to point out, because something you mentioned earlier and just now in talking about this is that, so-and-so wouldn't make this up. I can't imagine her lying. And we know through statistics, which I know are easy to set aside, but we know that the instances of false reporting when it comes to sexual assault are no different than the instances of false reporting in any other crime. So they're not dramatically higher. There are not a bunch of, and I'm going to say women because women are the predominant victims, but there are not a bunch of women angrily running around and making up stories just to get back at somebody. So I do want to point that out. Let's get back to your podcast, though. What's been the most difficult aspect for you? I know we talked earlier before we started recording that it's hard to hear these heavy things. It's emotionally draining for you just to hear them. So is that the most difficult thing in doing this? Or if not, what is?
Yeah, I think I think that's definitely a big piece. Like I think when I first started the show, I underestimated the toll that it takes to, and I think from what you said, it's kind of the same thing from your perspective. Like you think, like, I've heard these stories, I've talked to people privately, and we've had conversations about it, and I do okay. It is different. For example, like, I mean, like I said, I'm getting 20, 30, 40 emails and messages and constant barrage 24/7. I'm getting some kind of communication from somebody, whether it's just going in, I'm seeing the notification, like people saying, essentially saying, me too, this happened to me too, this happened in, here, and they're laying that out for me. And when I first started the show, I would just do interviews any time of day, like whenever it was good for them. And I would do 6, 7, 8 interviews. And it's like, okay. And what happened is I would get to this point where I would just hit my breaking point, and then I'd be out of commission and be like, I can't handle this anymore. I need to take a break. I'll step back. And so it was a very unhealthy, like, I would barrage myself with all this information, then freeze up, and then go back into it full force. And so the best thing that I did was just taking time to schedule these out, give myself time to process it, at least go for a walk. Like, literally I would tell somebody, okay, after this, I'm going to go check the mail with my daughter and take 10 minutes to reset, like that stuff became so important. And I can't even take credit for that. Like, it literally was talking to a trauma therapist I had in the show. And she's like, what do you do to relax? And I said, walk. And she said, take walks after interviews. Oh, thank you. Like, I feel like I should pay you for your time, because but it's so simple, but it's so effective. Like, so I would say the hardest part is just the volume of stories, but then I'd say the second hardest part goes back to the legal system. It's now, I have a year and a half in, I have some really close relationships with people that I've had on the show who become good friends. And the hardest thing now is that in the last few months, I've had a lot that have wrapped up their legal, side of things, and trying to encourage them when they're not seeing anything really happen, like when they're seeing a slap on the wrist for something that has had a life-altering effect on them. That's been very hard. And it, again, a number is fairly easy to cope with, but when you know that, when I know someone specifically by name, and I know their background, I know the levels of trauma that they've been through, I know the therapy they're going through, and then they're saying that their case was dropped because there's not enough evidence, or the statute of limitations was, they can't confirm whether she was this age, or this time, or this, and that's very hard. Like, again, having the relationships makes it difficult to ignore this issue.
Did you find, before you really enacted these wellness practices for yourself, and I'll say what you can take credit for is sharing that with me, because now I will start following your advice of, not going. But before you did that, were you finding that this emotional heaviness was affecting your family relationships as well?
Yeah, it was hard. It was definitely tricky. So like the beginning of 2020, like I was, again, I think I was isolated by design a little bit. Like I started kind of, not even by design, because I wouldn't say it was a voluntary thing. I just I was dealing with the weight of this stuff. I have a daughter, I don't want my wife thinking about a lot of this all the time. And like, I spend, when I'm up here, my door's shut and I have my microphone out, I'm talking about rape and pedophilia and, horrific things that I don't, things that are hard for me to process. And then I'm also going like, I don't want to talk about this anymore once I open the door and go out. Like, I just want to hang out. But then also, like, I don't want to freak out my wife and go like, this happened, this person was at this place. And, and so I kind of just would shut down a little bit. And then on top of that, COVID hit, my business tanked in the beginning of the year. So financially, things were extremely difficult. So it did have a lot of effect. I feel like, again, it was taking those steps. It was communicating, like, even little things like saying, hey, I don't want to talk about this specifically right now. Or, hey, instead of just putting up the wall and then being like, and then just walking down and being in a bad mood and no context for why, or walking downstairs and being depressed and no reason why. And so for me, even just going downstairs and going like, that was a really hard one, or, hey, this trauma therapist just recommended this, and I'm going to take a walk really quick. Like that stuff became very valuable, and communication was just a big key there. But my wife's awesome, and like she's been understanding, and she's the reason. Like I said, she's always been well, do it or don't do it. Just do what you need to do. And she's been super supportive and understanding, and and it's where I've had to improve a lot is just recognizing that, like I'm able to do this because she clears the runway for a lot of this to happen. So, but
what would you give as your top piece of relationship advice to everyone out here watching and listening?
Don't go to me for relationship advice. No. Go to an expert. My advice for everything, whether it's legal, whether it's that, is go to an expert. That's always my go-to piece of advice. But if I can give my amateur armchair quarterback advice about it, I would say communication's key. And I know that's a cliche, but I think a lot of times when especially if you're working separately than your spouse, which I think is most people, or separately from your girlfriend, you have to realize you're spending 40 hours a week at least living a different life than they are. And I think that there's an expectation that someone should understand where you're coming from, because you live with them. But the reality is you're still spending half of your time away. And half of your time hearing, like I have relationships with people that she doesn't have. I have conversations she's not having. I'm thinking about, she may be downstairs thinking about, I'm stressed because I'm not getting help picking up the house, and, dealing with this with our daughter, doing this or this situation. I'm sitting upstairs going like, I'm frustrated because I feel like I'm bearing the weight of this podcast or about this. And so like to be able to sit down and just verbalize it is such a big step in being able to understand where you're coming from and give the context. And then also a level beyond that is like setting the boundaries, like any relationship, to say, hey, I really don't want to talk about, like for me, she'll try to read me certain things in the news. I'm like, my margin for hearing like bad news about things is very low. So like right now, so like, can we talk about it at a different time, or can we talk about something else, or, that kind of thing. Like just setting all those healthy things and just saying what you're feeling is a big piece. But I know that's the most cliche advice ever, but I would say just be really communicative about how you're feeling, why you feel the way you do, because you can't assume that someone understands where you're coming from when they're not with you 24/7 and in hearing everything you're hearing, and on the bad calls and good calls. It's just not reasonable to expect that of somebody.
Even though it's a little bit cliche, I think it's amazing advice, and it's advice that we've heard before here.
Yeah. It's cliche for a reason.
Right. Yes. So I think it's fantastic. As you know, we like to end this show, each episode, with a little bit of tattoo talk to lighten the mood, because we always talk about heavy things. The viewers and listeners love it. So I do know that you don't have any tattoos. However, you might want a tattoo. Is that correct?
Yes. And I wish I would have known. I would have just gotten one while we were doing the recording.
Yes. Team player.
I really do want one. I've been talking about getting a sleeve for like a long time. But I have a kid, so I'm always like, I can't justify going and spending that much money on a tattoo. But also too, I just like, maybe it's my Baptist. It's so permanent. And I'm always like, what if I change my mind about this? But the one tattoo I have consistently wanted for the last like almost 10 years now, so I'm probably safe, is I love the painting of the Last Supper. Like I really love that painting. And there's a really cool sleeve of that I've always looked at, and like I've just said that's going to be what it is eventually. But I don't know when that's going to be, so maybe it'll just always be in my in my mind. But that's been what I've wanted to do. It will be, if I do it, I'll definitely have to do content while I'm getting a tattoo, because it's I think that would be entertaining, and I have no pain tolerance whatsoever. So I'll probably be a very emotional, crying child the whole time. So
what is so fantastic is that you immediately jump to a sleeve. We didn't go with,
no.
I want a tiny little this or that.
I don't like that.
Sleeve.
I see people that go get like the simple, like, because I people are like, oh, get your, get someone's name or get this date.
Don't get someone's name.
but it's so small. And what I like about tattoos is it's like a big piece of art. Like it's like a big, so like for me, it's like go big or go home. I would definitely get some small piece of it first, but like whenever I see someone, they have like just one small tattoo, so I'm like, just get some, go for it, And so right. I don't know, but I definitely know that I will not be pleasant to tattoo. So because I have literally no pain tolerance whatsoever. I'm a big baby. I've never done surgeries, never broken a bone. I've told people, I'm like, if I ever break a bone and the bone's coming out of my leg, just kill me on the spot, make it quick. I don't want to deal with the pain. So we'll see, but it'll be a good live stream when it happens for sure.
Yes. Well, I was going to recommend a couple artists that are near your area, but I want them to continue to be my friend. And so I'm not sure.
You're kicking them while they're tattooing me.
Right. I don't know if I'm going to recommend them, but
we'll see. Yeah.
We'll see.
It's we'll see what happens. I read that Justin Bieber gets put under he gets anesthesia before he gets tattoos. I swear to you, that's true. You can Google that. He gets put under so he can get large pieces of tattoos done, and which is such a sissy thing to do, but it's probably what I'll do. I'll probably just ask for the gas and then go for it.
That is cheating, and I did not know that was even a thing. So I am going to have to look that up. That's
it is for Bieber.
So don't be a Bieber, though.
Don't be Eric. That's good advice.
Don't be a Bieber.
No.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for your time today. I truly appreciate you being willing to share your story. I'm excited at the success of your podcast. For people that aren't now following you and want to see what you're all about and what your podcast is all about, where can they find you?
Yeah, the best place to find me would just be anywhere you listen to podcasts. It's just the Preacher Boys podcast. You'll see my face on the cover art. And I'm on social media everywhere with the handle @PreacherBoysDoc. So @PreacherBoysDoc. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all those good places. And then I'm on TikTok, the Eric Ski. So Eric SKI. That's the best places to find me.
Excellent. Well, Eric, again, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you. I hope you have a great day.
Awesome. Thank you.
I really hope you guys appreciated as much as I did Eric's willingness to share with us why he is so passionate about exposing IFB church abuse and what he sees going forward with his podcast. So remember, until next week, you are strong enough and you are worth it. Thank you for listening to the Strong Enough podcast. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform by searching Strong Enough. And on YouTube, we're available on the Spear Talk channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook @StrongEnoughPod. If you have suggestions for an upcoming episode or a future guest, please reach out at strongenoughpod@gmail.com. Remember, you are worth it.